Hello and welcome to this edition of Blade to Thunder. I'm Glen.
I'm Kevin.
And today we are going to be preparing the fuselage of the MD500 and
I'll be trial fitting the mechanics.
Okay, so I am going to be preparing the fuselage by fitting the skids and preparing the mounting blocks ready to take the mechanics.
My job today is to get the mechanics stripped and prepped for trial fitting into the body.
Okay, so we've got the model here set out with all the parts that we're going to be using in this part of the video. Okay, and this part is we're going to dry fit the skids and then epoxy them in. So what we're going to need are the front and rear legs and the skids. Okay, the fuselage, gloves, 5-minute epoxy, something to mix the epoxy up on, a round file, something to mix the epoxy with, some kitchen towel to get rid of any excess at the end, and the instructions. Okay, so the instructions tell us to fit the legs and glue them in and then fit the skids. I don't think that's a particularly good idea because the skid legs fit into the fuselage and they're quite loose, so there's the possibility of misalignment. So when you once the epoxy is set and you go to fit the skids, they might be too far misaligned that you can't get them in and you're going to have to take it all out again. So what I recommend you do, and this is what I'm going to do, is I'm going to dry fit the skids into the legs because they're quite tight, so they hold themselves in position while the epoxy is setting. Okay, so if you notice, you have two different heights on the footstep. Okay, and normally the higher one goes at the front and the lower one goes at the back if you're doing this true to scale, and as we are eventually going to be doing this to a true scale model, that's what we're going to do, but you can do it any way round you like, it's your model. Okay, so the skid legs fit in, they go through the hole in the fuselage and you thread them through to the hole, the square hole inside in the woodwork. Okay, and then this is where you will epoxy it. Okay, and then the rear one goes in the same way, and it's all very loose at the moment. And what you need to look for when you do this is that it's not going to wobble too much. Okay, so we're going to take these out. Remember, start with the front and just push it through. Then push the back one through. Make sure you've got them the rake is the same. Okay, so they're pointing backwards, and then you can just adjust them a little bit so they fit through. Okay. Once they've got the skids in, they hold their position so much better. You may have to just use a round file to open open up the hole for the skids. Don't worry too much about getting them straight at this point because they're not going to be glued until the skids are dry. And you'll also notice that we're doing this on a towel to protect the fuselage so it doesn't get scratched. Okay. Just go back a bit. So here we go. Right, so that's the skids dry fitted. So the next stage will be to epoxy them in. Okay, so we've got to the dry fit stage, and the next stage is we're going to epoxy in the top of the skids only, not the bottoms, just the tops. Okay, and we're going to do that by putting epoxy into the hole there on all four, and then pushing the skids in and holding it in place on the skids using a weight. If you don't have a weight, a LiPo battery will do just as well, or several LiPo batteries. So we're going to mix up the resin, so it's equal parts of resin and an equal part of hardener. Pop on some gloves. And mix it up really thoroughly. So it takes about 30 seconds to get it really well mixed up. 5-minute epoxy is quite thick, so it should hold itself in the hole. That's why we're dabbing the rest in. Don't overdo it with the epoxy because too much is as bad as too little, so just enough to fill the hole, because any excess that you put on the top you've got to remove later on, so make life easy for yourself now. Okay, so as you can see it's quite thick, and we'll start at the back because it's just filling the holes up. You can just see we're just putting enough in to fill them up. Okay, and now we're just going to fettle through the skids. Oh, that one's dropped out, that's not good. Okay, just hold that there. I'll take a sec. Okay, because we're working against the clock, and get it in. Okay. Take your paper towel and just rub any excess away from the top. Okay, and then towards the front, put your weight in. Just make sure everything's gone in properly. That one's been a bit of a pain, so we're just going to hold that a little bit. Just make sure, using your eye, just make sure everything's in level and quite happy. Right, take your time. Don't be afraid to hold on to it for a little while the epoxy is setting. And what we're looking for is just rock the helicopter from the top slightly, just make sure it's not wobbling. So this cures in about 5 minutes. It's set, and then it takes about 24 hours to fully cure. Okay, so don't go flying this. If you put it in a couple of hours, don't go flying it until at least 1 day.
Hello there. Right, you've just seen Glen sticking or gluing the legs into the fuselage, and it's my turn to prep the mechanics and get them ready for dry fitting. and making sure everything's going to work as we want it to. Now we have a multi-blade head, which we've got to obviously take the blades from, and we've got to take the tail off. With a multi-blade head, it's always best to mark them that when you put it all back together, the same blade goes into the same blade grip. Then that way you know it's going to be tracking right and you're not going to get any vibrations. So we'll proceed with doing that, and as and when little tips come up, I will try and remember to bring that to your attention. One very good tip: whenever you take things apart, have a little pot to put your nuts and bolts and screws in, because if you put them down, you knock them down, you've lost them. It's also best good quality tools, and always have them to hand when you can. Now when it comes to the blades, you can either put the screw through the blade and keep hold of it that way, or just put it in the pot, depending on how you feel. As long as you always make sure, screw the nut back onto the bolt, put it in the pot, and then move on to the next one. Nuts and bolts safely stored. Put these together, put them somewhere safe, out of the way for refitting. And when it comes to the tail, this has got the tail rotor on the left hand side of the mechanics. This has been done ready for a future model, etc. Some models, depending on what you have, the tail rotor will be on the other side of the mechanics. Taking it apart is basically the same. Depends on whether you've got a torque tube or you've got a belt. Torque tubes, as this model is, are reasonably straightforward. You just undo the two screws that holds the tail on and it slides off. If you've got one that has a belt, then it's a lot more involved. You have to strip the tail down so you can unlace the belt, and when you do that, it would always be best to have something, a cable tie or something you can just stop the belt from sliding back into the tube. Otherwise you're then fishing and cursing and swearing at yourself because you've lost the belt. Not the end of the world, wouldn't be the first time. Okay, so let's take the tail off. Again, always best practice, take the blades off. All parts in the pot. Must remember, good quality ball link pliers. Pop the ball off. No levering it with a screwdriver, etc., because you'll end up damaging the ball. With a torque tube, if all goes well, then just a very gentle wriggle, 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 little bit of a twist just to ease it, and it will slide off gently. You shouldn't have to use too much force. As it gets towards the end, it's nice and gently, and the tail drive comes off in one complete assembly, again, which you can fit in the pot. And its drive shaft, you can either leave it in there or take it out, depending on what you'd like to do. If it stays in there, leave it where it is. Now the next step is to remove the skids. On this particular model, 2 screws, nice and easy, which are no major problems. I will come to a slight change between ages of models when I come to show you the base plate. Does help to pick up the right Allen key. Okay, and that is the skids removed and the airframe stripped down, ready to be put in the fuselage. There's one little small thing to bring to your attention, is fitting this nice plate. Now this is an adapter plate, because with this being a later Pro model, the skids are held in with just 2 screws. This plate, obviously we have a centre bolt, so it has the 3 centre holes for mounting that straight onto there. The carbon plate stays where it is. This is a 3mm ply that adapts it from a 3-bolt fixing to the 4-bolt fixing. Now the difference there is on the slightly earlier models, the skids are actually held on with the 4 screws, and that's why we have to have the adapter that takes it from the 3 to the 4, so we can then easily fit it into the fuselage, and it makes it nice and secure. Now, as this is a dry fit, we won't bother putting Loctite on. We want to make sure that this is going to be able to take apart a few times, as we all do with the fitting of the mechanics into the scale fuselage. It's going to be coming in and out a few times, so we don't lock tight until it's the final fit. Again, we've got 1 extra screw here in the middle to take out. Again, we try not to disturb the plate that's in there. Now this plate is the same front and rear, it's no difference, so all we have to do is make sure that the plate is mounted on there. When fitting parts, never tighten them all up until every single bolt is then started first. Otherwise you can find misalignment and you could end up either damaging threads, stripping threads, just general frustration because it's not going together. Okay, and there we are. That is now ready to be dry fitted into the fuselage. Once the glue's gone off and we're all set and happy, we're passing it back to Glen. Again, make sure the parts that you've taken off, safe and secure, they can't get lost, you know exactly where they came from, and they're all in one position. You haven't dotted them around your workshop. Okay, thank you very much.